Okay, hi, I'm Dana Frank, and I'm used to being a teacher, although I just retired, and I'm used to seeing the whites of my students' eyes. So if anybody wants to move closer up, and I didn't know it was going to be live streamed, so there's lights in my eyes, and I can't see as well. So if people want to move up, okay, now no one will move up. But that's fine, because a bunch of Hondurans are showing up any minute now, and they'll fill up the space, and they will nod and smile at whatever I say. I just want to start, and before Juan and I do our thing, just switching back from Spanish to English here, I want to thank a bunch of people. The book my name is on the book, and I said this in Washington, D.C. last night at an event, but although my name is in the book, it's about a collective project, and the book itself is a collective project, and it's a very difficult thing to care about Honduras all day, every day. It's like receiving blows almost every day, and the flip side of that is the joyous solidarity with and among the Honduran people and among those of us in other parts of the world that support the Honduran people, and that collective project has been a great joy. So in this particular moment, I want to thank Verso Books for this space and the staff that are running all this and all the beautiful work that Verso does. I want to thank the Jacobin for sponsoring this officially. I want to thank the Jacobin for running 2 interviews with me in the last couple of years, not just the one about Honduras, but also about Buy American campaigns and anti-Asian racism, which is one of my previous intellectual lives. Also the Jacobin for excerpting the section about the axe murders, which I've now called the President of Honduras, an axe murder in print, an alleged axe murder in 2 different places. I want to thank NACLA, the joyous NACLA. I'm 62 years old, but I was young when NACLA was already not young, and I came of age reading NACLA in the 70s. And they were like mythical people out there, and they still kind of are. And NACLA has just been there for so long with left analysis of Latin America, written with really great research, but for accessible. And I'm very indebted to them, and for co-sponsoring, and also for running the article that I wrote right after the coup, which was about the historical origins of the resistance. And that was, for me, it was like a great moment for me to be in NACLA. And finally, I want to thank Haymarket Books, and I just had a very good 30-minute dinner with Anthony Arnove, but there are so many people to thank at Haymarket, and Haymarket is booming, and it's really amazing to watch Haymarket thrive. And there's some particular, I want to thank Charlotte, who I just met. I want to thank Amy Rosenberg, who lives in New York, who was my editor, who I've never met. I want to thank Julie Fain, the managing editor. Many of these people I've never met, they're mostly in Chicago. I want to thank Dangon Blanchard, who is the publicity person, and I've never had a publicist. I've had amazing publicists, but it's what she set up, and the publicity engine of Haymarket. And the book isn't getting reviewed anywhere, and it got some pre-publication reviews on the mainstream press, whether it's because I'm too far to the left or Haymarket is too far to the left, or they just don't review that many books. But it's watching how alternative media and institutions are moving the book is really moving, especially because the book is really not about me, it's about Honduras. And at this moment with the caravan of border politics, I'm so grateful for how all those folks are moving it out there. I want to thank Democracy Now! And Juan. It's so thrilling. This is one of the great honors of my life, and he moved heaven and earth to be able to be here tonight. And it's been so amazing the way Democracy Now! Has come through since the day of the coup, with just amazing reporting there. So I did them yesterday morning, and the way Amy and Juan are on top of it, the trust and the analysis that they have. And I want to thank both of them, Nermeen as well, and Laura Godestinger, who just left, but was a producer doing Honduras that did so much of the background work for many years. And I'm being New York centered here. Last night was DC, and two people in New York I want to thank that were very supportive. And one is Daniel Alarcón, the novelist, who read some of the early chapters when nobody else had and was supportive, and also blurbed the book. And also Jonathan Blitzer at the New Yorker, who also is out of town and couldn't come, and has been very supportive. And also in writing about Berta Cáceres. And you may know that we're waiting for the verdict on the trial. We thought we were going to have it by now, but nothing came out as far as, no? Okay, well, maybe we can tell us later, okay, what happened, because I've been watching the papers. And finally, I want to thank these folks in the front row, Roberta Quesada, who is a novelist from Honduras and worked for the Zalaga government in the UN at the time of the coup, has been in exile ever since, and Lucy Pagoada here, who is really the center of the Honduran activist community in New York City, and also supporting the Garifuna Afro-Indigenous people in exile throughout New York City, and perhaps invisible world of the Hondurans in the whole greater New York City area. And so if you're interested in making those connections, I just really want to also honor them for the work they've done, because I work for them, and one of the joys of this whole project that the book is about is this beautiful solidarity with the Honduran people. And I want to thank another person, Francisco Alvarado. Where are you, Francisco? Who I just got to meet, who is a Honduran artist in the United States, a prominent artist who does really beautiful work and lives in New York. So I want to really honor and uplift the Hondurans in the room here. So and then I just want to say a little bit about the book, and then I'll be to the service of where Juan is going to take me. This is so much easier when you do democracy now. You're in a little room in another part of the country, and you're staring at this little camera, and you hear Amy and Juan do all the headlines for 20 minutes, and you sit there in terror with this little thing in your ear, and you go like, please make me able to do it, please make me able to do it, please make me not drool, and then their voice comes on, and then you don't drool, and that's actually usually. And so it's so much easier to actually have eye contact and be able to see them. But I just want to say 5 minutes about the book itself. I say this in the introduction, but probably most of you haven't read it. Before the coup, I worked for 8 years with the banana unions in Honduras, and I wrote a book about women's projects in the banana unions of Latin America, and especially Honduras, and did solidarity work with the banana workers. And then I wrote a little book about women's projects in the banana unions, and then I started writing a book about the AFL-CIO's intervention in Honduras during the Cold War. And in 2009, when the coup happened, I hadn't been there for a year. I'm like, it's really hot and humid in the banana zone. I'm out of here. I really love Honduras, but I'm moving on. And then the coup happened, and as I say in the book, I won't repeat it, but it changed my whole life and all of our lives. And I got up every morning and sobbed and tried to figure out what I could do to stop it, and it changed my life utterly. And it's been almost 10 years. It's the 10th anniversary on June 28th. And when the coup happened, I tried to figure out what I could do about it to stop it. And part of that story is in the book. And mostly the first 2 years, I wrote op-eds and articles, and I wrote them for many years. And then I eventually went to Congress and did a lot of work in Congress, which I talk about in the book. But from a literary point of view, I started writing these articles that all sounded alike, and I started calling them Dana's Atrocity Report from Honduras. Not officially, but to myself, because it was like, hi, here's the latest horrible thing, here's how the U.S. is supporting it, here's what you can do instead. And everyone was the same after a certain point, except some of the ones for The Nation had a more, I was able to write with a more literary quality, and it was killing me as a writer, and I had created nonfiction and history books before this. And so I started clearly, entirely for creative writing purposes, I started writing stories of some of the things that had happened to me or that I had witnessed since the coup. And it was sort of a creative outlet and also a psychological outlet. And I gradually had a mess of them, and I showed them to a couple publishers, and I wanted to maybe put them together in a book, and they said, we need context, give us a single narrative book. And I didn't want to write a single narrative book because it was too painful to go back and talk about what had happened. And finally, enough time had passed, and about 2 years ago, I decided to embed my personal stories in that larger narrative book, so the historian in me could, I want this stuff written down, and I had, by that point, 6-7 years of emails that I'd written to congressional aides, as well as 35 articles to draw on, and years of interviews and clipping files from emails that I had sent to these aides, and I was able to draw on that and so embed my stories in the big story. So I didn't start out writing a book about Honduras myself at the center of the story, but I had these stories, and I think it helps the reader because it's really hard to just read the horror stories, and I wanted there to be, in some cases, comic relief, in some ways it's just a relief from the style of telling you the big story. But I also wanted people to see that what the State Department did and how we experienced the nefariousness of U.S. imperialism in real time. and how that plays out and how they do it. And you can see in the book is my own learning curve, despite the fact that I knew in my day job as a U.S. historian, I thought I knew this, but watching it happen in lifetime as we speak as well is part of what the book is about. And the last thing I want to say is the book is also about the politics of the media and the mainstream media in the United States, because we can talk about the joys of the alternative media, but the mainstream media has mostly been hideous. And there have also been some bright lights. And there's also been some middle ground. And there's been some really beautiful work, particularly by the Associated Press, that I talk about in the book. But if you watch the media coverage right now, it's sort of classic Honduras immigration story, which is, here's the news about Honduras, here's how terrible it is. Everybody is oppressed by gangs and violence, and everybody is powerless, and here's the mother sobbing in the morgue. Okay, that's over her dead child. Now, of course, that is also a true story of what's going on in Honduras, but why there's the gangs and violence, why it's so terrible, it's almost like it's a natural disaster, and we can talk about why it isn't. But I wanted to counter that, not just with the agency of the Honduran and U.S. governments, but with the joy of the Honduran people in struggle. And Lucy and Roberto and the other Hondurans here know this, that it's not just the Honduran people have an amazing spirit and resilience and joy, and the resistance was a great surprise and a spectacular thing, and still is. And the book has a lot of stories about people dancing, about people coming to Washington and having a good time, about me going down there and celebrating birthdays, and that spirit of resistance and joy, and also the real power of the resistance and the opposition more broadly. Since the coup is a piece of the story that disappears. And the book is, in fact, I wanted to have a title that was less dark, because I wanted a title that captured that tension between the joy and the terror. I went for resistance instead of joy, but let me just end by, I want to point out this photograph at the end of the book that I wanted to have on the cover, and the publisher, their wonderful publisher, said, it's too hard to explain, but I will now explain it to you, okay? See this photograph? You probably can't see it. I'll show it for the camera. But this is on International Women's, Honduran Women's Day last year, which is January 25th, which is also my birthday, but as well as the birthday of Honduran women's suffrage. But these are women. The president's initials are JOH for Juan Orlando Hernandez, and the slogan for many years has been "Fuera Ho," which means Juan Orlando Hernandez out. So these are women dressed all in black, so you can't tell, they can't be identified, and they're wearing giant white diapers with "Fuera Ho" across the bottom, and taunting a SWAT team that's lined up all across in front of them on International Women's Day, 2 or 3 days before the inauguration of the false inauguration of Juan Orlando. And that's the spirit of the Honduran resistance that I also want to celebrate. It's not just the story of the terrifying security forces. So I'll just end there. Oh, that was easy. Now we have the hard part.
Well, good evening to everyone, and I think Dane and I are going to have a good conversation. I want to preface the conversation with just a couple of remarks. Honduras is sort of the forgotten nation of Central America. It's I guess all the other nations of Central America at one point or another have gotten a lot of attention over the decades. And I remember the first time that I went to Honduras was in 1990. I was a columnist at the New York Daily News, and there was this big story that had developed in local story up in the Bronx. Some jilted lover was angry at his girlfriend for jilting him, and she was working as a coat check girl at a social club called the Happy Land Social Club in the South Bronx. And he went to confront his girlfriend at the club. The bouncers threw him out, and so he ran a few blocks away, got an empty gasoline can, filled the can with gasoline, and went back to the social club and poured the gasoline over the front entrance of the social club about 1 o'clock in the morning and set the place on fire. 87 people were killed that night. And until the World Trade Center attack, it was the biggest mass murder ever committed in New York City. And of the 87 people who were killed, I think 65 of them were from Honduras. It was a social club, largely of the Garifuna in the South Bronx. And so my editor said to me, well, they're going to be taking a whole lot of bodies back to Honduras, go and cover the stories of the bodies returning to Honduras. So I ended up going to San Pedro Sula and Puerto Cortes and a bunch of the different towns, basically following the caskets of all of, because many of them were undocumented and many of them were young people, and as the caskets arrived to the homes of the different families and the funerals were held, and basically telling the story of all these people who had come to America seeking a dream and ended up burning up in this social club in the South Bronx. As a result, I ended up being able to spend a lot of time in the Maquila zone of Puerto Cortes and getting a sense of what was going on in Honduras at the time. And so it helped me sort of formulate my ideas in terms of a book I was writing at the time on the history of Latinos and this whole question of the empire creating conditions that then lead to these mass migrations. So I think it's really timely and important that Dana's book has come out now, because as we're seeing now, it came at precisely the right time when the entire country is confronting this issue of these caravans that are coming up from Central America, largely of Hondurans, but also some Guatemalans and Salvadorans, but largely of Hondurans, and why all of a sudden are so many Hondurans coming to the United States. And I think that's, I wanted to ask you to begin the conversation. You're a historian, and my wife is a historian, and she tells me that you don't write history until at least 30 years have passed from the events that have occurred. Yet you've written a book that is a history, but it really deals with what's happened in the last 10 years. And clearly, I think some of your sense as a historian was that you want to write history that affects the present, right? So I wanted to talk to you about that conflict of, as a historian, deciding to delve into a contemporary subject.
Well, you know, the books I had written before were about much earlier periods than when I wrote the book on Buy American campaigns. That was the first time when I wrote a book that came up to the present, and I wrote it in 1999, and I thought there would be this moment when it would change, you know, but I actually methodologically think like a historian, which means I have to do a lot of footnotes. I'm always jealous of some other disciplines that they don't have to. And I think if you're a historian, you think analytically and you watch for patterns, and so you look for how details add up to large patterns. But in this case, it's an interesting question for me what it was like methodologically, because at the same time, in this case, I was doing that kind of analytical thinking about patterns because of all the articles I wrote all this time. And I had to learn to see the papers and see, oh, I've now seen 3 references to that. Something's up, you know, and to watch that kind of patterns and in live time, and then gradually getting used to working with a lot of congressional aides, and it became sort of my job to find those patterns and summarize for them in real time. And there haven't been a lot of people tracking Honduras, and there's a team of us that do. But I think that's the historian side of me. The difference is, in this case, I was both a historian and an activist and an actor in the story eventually. And that's the other piece of it that I am, and I say this in the book, that about halfway through I step into the story as an actor, not just an analyst. And that's when it becomes more complicated, I think. And somebody asked me, a Republican high-ranking congressional aide asked me a couple months ago, like he just paused in the middle of a high-powered conversation. He says, wait a minute, are you an activist or are you an academic? And I had my answer ready, and I just in the back of my head, I said, if I were an academic and I knew all this and I didn't do something about it, there would be something morally wrong with me. And I think that's how I square that circle. And but, you know, the historian in me also thinks that there's some parts of the book that I'm worried about are too weedy, as in too much in the weeds about the State Department stuff. And I made that choice that I might lose some readers, particularly in the chapter on Juan Orlando, the rise of Juan Orlando. I made a decision that I wanted that stuff there for the historical record. That it might not be what every reader wants, but I wanted people to know what happened. And I think that's the sort of pure historian in me, not just the activist.
And in terms of as you mentioned, I thought some of the most, the stuff that you had on the repression and the detail on the level of repression that has not gone reported here, I think was really important. But also the education of Professor Frank in Washington, to me, and at the very sort of basic level, as when you started meeting with all of these aides, the pecking order among the aides in Congress and the acronyms that they were constantly using. Could you talk a little bit about that process? Because it was almost like it was like Mr. Smith goes to Washington.
Yeah.
You had no idea that this is how the government works.
Well, there's two learning curves in the book, and the first one, very first section is called Learning Curves, and that was learning about the coup, trying to figure out what to do, making connections with the networks of people in the United States and the world, and with the Hondurans that I knew a lot of Hondurans at this point. So that's the first learning curve, and we can talk about it. But the second learning curve that you're asking for is about 2011. As I said, I was writing all these op-eds, and Obama wasn't exactly doing what I said in the last paragraph. And so I tried to figure out what to do, and it really was a search for power. And I started going to Washington and trying to figure out how to do it. And let me tell you, it's all true. Well, I don't know what, we have a Honduran flag here. Great. Okay, we're having a hello. I'm just so happy to see the Hondurans here. I'm a nationalist at heart, but I'm a Honduran nationalist. But I say in the book, I did not know what I was doing. I was like, I had not even seen how Mr. Bill's Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law. I can tell you, despite being a U.S. history professor, I didn't know. I met with George Miller's top aide, who I saw last night for the first time in years, and I thought you just go in there and say, "Hi, would you stop the coup?" And that's all you had to do, and you just had to get. And so the book I actually talk about, and I want to say this is a historian thing too. There are books that are about solidarity movements with Chile, with Brazil, but I went back and read them. There's always like a curtain in front of what happened in Congress. Like suddenly Congress put out a law. Suddenly this and that happened, and it's never written about because there's all these rules that you're not supposed to talk about it because it's as if the Congress member or the senator just did it, and they decided to care. When actually there's a huge number of people that knock on doors, and the doors are usually closed, and how you have to learn how to do it. And we had a whole national solidarity movement that made it possible. This is not just about me. I mean, we got 94 members of Congress at one point to say cut police and military aid. There's still 71 on record right now, and that is a big national get out the vote movement. So it's not just about me, but it's also true that, this is like all like House of Cards 101. I mean, nobody got killed that I know of except the Hondurans. And I mean that, but it was also like, it's really creepy crawly, and you start becoming, I say this, it's like Harry Potter and the snakes inside you, and I learned to love the game, but it's also about being in combat, and you have to triangulate power, and you have to charm and be charmed, and you have to figure out who's connected to who, and you get slammed sometimes, and you get backstabbed, and it is very difficult. And I every 6 months I would go, and then I'd leave, and so I'm never going back. I'm kind of in that phase right now. It's a very difficult to do, and then when you actually get some little measure of power over this really terrible situation, then it's a deep thrill, right? So it's a very complicated story, and I made that was the hardest part of the book to write by a mile, because I had a hard time finding a voice, and I was giving away the playbook, how we did it, and which is dangerous. I'm giving it away to the Honduran government, exactly who we were and how we did it, and everyone gave me permission. Every aide I quote gave me permission, which is a really big deal. But I wanted future activists, again, it's the historian in me, I wanted future activists to know how we did it. And I also wanted to say, look, I didn't know what I was doing. You don't have to know what you're doing to learn it, right? You too can go, and that's also about democracy in the face of the vast moneyed powers that run our government.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, because this whole issue of the migration and the massive migration we're seeing now, if you look back into the 80s, when there were civil wars in Salvador and in Guatemala, and there was the ongoing war of the Contras against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, you had a huge influx of Salvadorans especially of Salvadorans, but of Guatemalans as well. And and subsequently then also of Nicaraguans, to escaping the violence. And Honduras was sort of like the base area of the U.S. reaction. That's where Oliver North and the whole band of Reagan people who were sponsoring and financing the Contra War did all their flights came in and out of Honduras, and their agents went in and out of Honduras. So it was almost like being utilized as a base area for counter-revolution in Central America. But you note in the book that there was already a strong labor movement in Honduras. It just had not gotten to the point of actual armed conflict between the government and those who were who were organizing democratic resistance. So now suddenly it's changed. To some degree, all the civil wars were ended in the other countries, although there's still many problems in those countries. But now the focus has shifted to Honduras as a center of repression. And could you talk about that, how that change occurred, and then also the coup itself, and why it was so necessary to get rid of Zelaya?
Well, you know, Honduras was always seen as, I mean, my friends would say this, it was not seen as the cool place in Honduras. It wasn't a site of mass armed struggle. The famous moment of Honduras is actually 1954, where there was a general strike in Honduras that went for 6 weeks, and almost the entire economy was shut down by banana workers. And that led to tremendous U.S. intervention. But as you say, Honduras has also always been used as the base to invade other countries. In 1954, most famously also, right at the same time, in the middle of this general strike, it was used as the base for the CIA-backed invasion of Guatemala that led to the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Guatemala, of Jacobo Arbenz. And then during the Contra War, during the 1980s, during the Contra War, it was the armed bases at Palmarola, the Sotocano Air Force Base was the armed base for the Contra War against the Sandinistas. And Honduras did have a serious left, but it was repressed, and death squads killed a lot of those people. But it was not the center of an armed struggle in the same scale as the other countries, and there's various reasons for that. But what the story that people didn't follow was during the 1990s and 2000s, the social movements were actually growing in Honduras. The indigenous movement, the Afro-Indigenous movement, the women's movement, LGBT movement, and human rights groups. So Zelaya himself is a member of the elite. He came from one of the two right-wing parties that have governed the country for decades. He came from the elite, but he started moving leftward somewhat when he was president. And he started aligning himself with the democratically elected left and center-left governments that had come to power in these years in Venezuela, Bolivia, Argentina, Nicaragua, Ecuador. And he started leaning leftward and also doing some progressive things like raising the minimum wage by 50%. And also something that gets left out of the story is he blocked privatizations that the elite were trying to take over the ports, the telephone company, the health service, and he blocked that, and angrifying, I can't say this in English, making the elites angry that what he wouldn't go along with. He didn't have much of a base himself. So the coup itself happened on June 28th, 2009, when he put a measure on the ballot. The president has a right to put a survey question on a ballot and have an election on that. And so the day of the coup, there was something called the Cuarta Urna, which is known as, refers to the fourth ballot box. And the question was, would you like to elect delegates in November, the following November, when there would be a presidential and regular elections? Would you like at that time to elect delegates to a future constitutional convention that would have happened 2 years down the road after Zelaya was long out of office? Okay, that was what was happening the day of the coup. So the right, the Honduran right, seized on that and said that Zelaya was trying to use it to get a second term. Okay, the Honduran constitution says very clearly that you can't have a second term, and you can't even advocate it publicly. It's illegal to advocate it publicly. It's very important because this is why the current president is completely illegal. Okay, so Zelaya never issued a peep. He never said a peep saying he wanted a second term. If there had been a constitutional convention, it would have happened long after he was out of office. And constitutional conventions had already happened in previous years in several other countries. leading to greater degrees of democracy and social justice in South America. So that was the day of the coup, and the coup itself was led by both the military, the entire Supreme Court, which had been named in part as people that were lined up that would support this, and the majority of the Honduran Congress all backed the coup, including the current president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was chair of a congressional committee that supported the coup. So it was the military, this is very important, it was a military coup nonetheless, which is important for the US legal response, and then they rounded him up and took him on a plane famously in his pajamas, to Costa Rica the morning of the coup.
Now, the way it was portrayed in the media here was that precisely that he was seeking to extend his term in office. And now, of course, in the context in Latin America, there had been some of the progressive leaders who, in the process of changing the Constitution, did also eliminate term limits. Chavez did it, Evo did it, and there is a tendency among leaders, even though the left don't want to stay in power, wants to in power, and that's a problem that comes back to haunt you. But in this particular case, he was not doing that. And as you're saying, and I think as most Americans aren't aware, the current president has done precisely that, right?
Well, yeah, the current president is a man named Juan Orlando Hernandez, and he's known popularly as Juan Orlando. So his first name is a compound first name, Juan Orlando. So if I say Juan Orlando, that means Hernandez. There's a lot of folks down there named Hernandez in the government, including his brother, who is just arrested for drug trafficking, his brother Tony. But Juan Orlando Hernandez was a member of Congress that supported the coup. And when he was president of Congress in 2012, he overthrew the Supreme Court in something called the technical coup, in which they falsely named new members of the constitutional part of the Supreme Court. And in the middle of the night. They just got rid of 4 out of 5 members of that part of the Supreme Court and named new ones, loyal to Juan Orlando. That Supreme Court, in turn, after Juan Orlando was elected president, perhaps fraudulently, we don't know, in 2013, then he wanted to run for a second term. That Supreme Court, in turn, in 2015, ruled completely illegally that the Constitution didn't apply, and that the Constitution violated international human rights norms, and that therefore anybody could run for president for a second term. And it's like, they don't have any rights. It's like the United States. You have to amend the Constitution. You can't just say, gee, the Constitution doesn't apply, okay? So using that as a pretext, he ran for re-election last year, well, in the primaries in 2016, and then in the general election last year. Completely illegal. It's illegal even to have advocated himself being on this running for a second term. It's very clear in the Constitution. And then, if I can finish with the election was November 27th, so we're just hit the first anniversary, and the election returns started coming in. The opposition candidate was a man named Salvador Nasrallah, who came from what used to be the anti-corruption party, and he ran in alliance with Xiomara Castro, the wife of the deposed President Zelaya, who had been the presidential candidate in 2013 of this new opposition party, Libre, that came out of the resistance to the coup, the first center-left opposition party in all of Honduran history. So Xiomara and Nasrallah ran as a joint ticket of the opposition alliance last year. And when the polls closed that night, the election returns started coming in, and when 50% of the votes had been counted, Nasrallah was ahead by 5-7%, and in that range, and the government shut down the computers for 2 days, and gradually over the course of the next week and a half, let out 5% of the results at the time, and lo and behold, Juan Orlando Hernandez won by 1.5% and was declared the president. And so there were huge demonstrations in response to this. I mean, as Vicky Cervantes of Honduras Solidarity put it, people in Honduras were full of rage and grief that the election had been so badly stolen, and people poured into the streets and blocked roads peacefully and did all kinds of demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations. And in response to that, the military and the police killed at least 22 people, maybe 40 people, depending. The UN says 22, the Honduran, I think it's more like 41, using live bullets for the first time since the coup, and that's all completely in impunity. The Organization of American States called for a new election for some time, and there's never been justice. And it's the anniversary of this just a couple days ago, And once again, the Honduran military and police used live bullets and injured important journalists, and this story is still unfolding.
And of course, whether it was under the Obama administration or the Trump administration, the position of the U.S. government toward what is happening there has been what?
Well, as I say in the book, it was green light after green light after green light. I mean, I think people here probably know that Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State at the time of the coup, and Obama was very new. I talked about in this book that I think a lot of people were caught off guard, thought Obama was going to be a liberal, thought he was going to be more progressive. He had even said something about, the night of Latin American coups is over. And so I think when the coup happened, we don't have a smoking gun showing exactly that the U.S. supported the coup in advance. I don't think it's plausible to think they didn't greenlight it. We certainly have generals talking with people from the embassy the night before. We know that. And so, but once the coup happened, Obama first says, well, we want them to settle it democratically. And then very quickly, the U.S. pivoted toward treating Roberto Micheletti, who was the leader of the coup, the post-coup de facto president, treating him as an equal to Zelaya, the democratically elected sovereign president of the country. So the U.S. moved the negotiations out of the OAS, the Organization of American States, which it couldn't control, and moved negotiations to Costa Rica, and kept treating Zelaya like he was an intruder in his own country, and treating Micheletti, the dictator, the leader of the coup, as an equal to the democratically elected sovereign president of the country. And what the U.S. did, and never said anything about the repression of this incredible opposition that rose up. So what the U.S. did is it played out the clock until the regularly scheduled elections in November, kept Zelaya from ever coming back, and then the opposition, almost all the opposition, pulled out of the elections. And a very important opposition presidential candidate had his arm broken by the police and was in the hospital part of this time, Carlos H. Bellis. And Berta Cáceres, his running mate at the time from the resistance, and then the U.S. recognized the only candidate left standing from the right-wing party, the National Party, Porfirio Lobo, and immediately recognized him. And Hillary Clinton put out a statement saying it was a beautiful example of democracy in action. And then that was the stabilization of what we call the post-coup regimes. So Hillary Clinton very clearly supported the coup. The mastermind behind this is someone you may not have heard of, named Thomas Shannon, who's been driving Latin America policy at the State Department until last January, when even he was too liberal for the Trump administration. But I want to underscore, it's not just, Hillary Clinton was responsible at the time. Obama was her boss. But it's also true that it's not just that, and that they had various moments then they could have changed this policy. That certainly when they certainly could have supported Xiomara Castro in the 2013 elections, when it was already clear that the horror that his post-coup Honduras was playing out so dramatically. They could have objected to Juan Orlando running illegally for president. Instead, they said, oh, well, that's up to the Hondurans to support. State Department officially said that. They could have called for a new election or for Nasrallah, recognized Nasrallah last winter. So it's green light after green light after green light, including under Secretary of State John Kerry and including under the Trump administration. So it's and the continuity figure here, if you want to know, is John Kelly. Can I say something about John Kelly?
Sure.
John Kelly was the head of the United States Southern Command before he was chief of staff, and he has said that Juan Orlando Hernandez was doing a magnificent job of fighting drug trafficking. A year and a half ago, he said that Juan Orlando was a great guy, a good friend and a great guy. And then he went on to be head of Homeland Security under Trump, and then his chief of staff. His assistant at the Southern Command was a man named James Nealon, who then became the U.S. ambassador to Honduras until a year ago. And then he went to Homeland Security with Kelly for a while. So you can see that military connection there and the continuity between the Obama administration and the Trump administration.
And of course, this is a continuity that goes beyond even living individuals. I'm reminded as you're telling the story of almost an exact same scenario was played out in the Dominican Republic in the late 1960s. In 1970s, most people forget that in the early 1960s, the Dominican Republic had a very liberal social democratic president, Juan Bosch, who was overthrown by the military and by the Dominican military, and there was an immediate insurrection in the Dominican Republic with the pro-democracy forces actually seizing control of the old city of Santo Domingo for many, many months in an armed insurrection. And then Lyndon Johnson sent in 25,000 American troops to defeat those who were in insurrection for democracy against the coup. I mean, he sent in the troops basically to preserve the coup leaders from being overthrown. And then under U.S. occupation, they held an election where one Bush was allowed to come back and run. But of course, he couldn't possibly succeed under that situation with the repression. And so it ended up with the right-hand man of the former dictator Trujillo coming to power and staying as president. Why am I blanking out on his name now? Is it Balaguer, Joaquin Balaguer, who had been Trujillo's right-hand man, then staying as president basically for the next 30 years. So they held an election, but it was an election with the repression of the pro-democracy forces occurring at the same time.
Whatever we called a demonstration election, which is a concept, from the 60s. And of course, here we see it again, and I talk about it explicitly in the book. It's like in Honduras, they have this phrase more and more lately where they say something in Spanish. They say this: "It's puro show." They say that in English, like it's just for propaganda purposes to say, look, here's democracy in action in Honduras, when in fact it's at the point of a gun.
And you mentioned Kelly talking about what a great guy Juan Hernandez is. Maybe some people haven't heard the news about his brother being arrested. He was arrested in Miami Friday and indicted. The indictment was released on Monday by the Southern District of New York, charging Antonio Hernandez with not only facilitating drug trafficking, but actually, according to the U.S. Attorney, they have video and audio tape recordings of him accepting $50,000 bribes from major drug dealers to provide armed guards to drug trafficking through Honduras from Colombia further north into Mexico. And this is the brother of the current president, who John Kelly says is a great guy.
Well, and the Associated Press, and particularly Martha Mendoza, Garance Burke, and Chris Sherman have done some really great work about Honduras in the last year and for years. And they did a really great article in February. Well, they did one that established that the new national director of the police and his two top lieutenants under him were drug traffickers moving cocaine, but also about Kelly and what Kelly must have known about drug trafficking when he was head of the Southern Command. And so I would just point people to that article. Now, we've known for a long time that there's narcos at the top to bottom in the Honduran government, and the narcos are very dangerous and murderous in Honduras. So this is not just, gee, we're on the side of what's wrong. I'm sure we all have critiques of the militarization of the drug war, but the pretext for the U.S. funding the Honduran government is that they're fighting drug traffickers. Okay, so that's the argument for the U.S. supporting the military. Of course, now we can talk about the caravan, and they're also helping the military help stop people from leaving their own country. Okay, we can get to that. But in this case, the government at the top is totally embedded with drug traffickers. As a major government picture said, like 4 or 5 years ago, there's narco congressmen, narco judges, narco, you name it. And certainly Juan Orlando's brother, but also Porfirio Lobo's son is in jail, his brother's being charged, his wife is in jail for corruption. I mean, Hilda Hernandez, who probably died in a helicopter accident a year ago. Now it's not clear whether she did die, but Juan Orlando's sister was charged with was alleged to be, I'm very careful, is alleged to be corrupt. So this is a very corrupt government from top to bottom that has also stolen the government coffers blind too. Juan Orlando himself and his party stole as much as $90 million from the National Health Service in 2013 to pay for their campaign. That's documented by the Attorney General, who's been sitting on the evidence. He said, yes, the documents, they have the checks and the bank accounts. He's been sitting on that evidence since 2014, at least. And of course now the Attorney General was just illegally reappointed to a 5-year term. He can have a new term, but the process was completely legal. They just suddenly brought him in from the outside and reappointed him without him having been a candidate for months of the process.
So let's get to the caravan, and now that we have better context in which to understand from whence the caravan came, the forces that have helped to propel or force so many people to flee their homeland. I'm wondering if you could talk about that, because it is not this massive repression that has now been unleashed for better part of a decade now, and since the coup, you've got the ongoing drought in a big section of Central America, and then you have the part that's gotten the most attention are the explosion of violence and drug gangs. Of course, but the part that is never talked about is the role of the United States in creating this drug gangs, because for the last 20 years, our government has been systematically grabbing young people who have served time in prison, who may have been legal residents of the United States or may have been undocumented, but as soon as they get out of prison, they're put on a plane and shipped back to the country from which they came, or where they were born. They may not have ever been there, but where they were born. It's happened to Dominicans, it's happened to Salvadorans, it's happened to Guatemalans, it's happened to Hondurans and to Mexicans. And so basically, people who learned how to be gang members here in the United States and drug dealers here in the United States were never rehabilitated in the prison system, but are now shipped out back to what is in essence a foreign land to them, to recreate their networks there. So this nexus of the political and government repression, the gang creation, and then the drought that has been now afflicting this part of the area.
Well, and it's not, the U.S. role is even bigger than that. Not just the treatment, the racist treatment of these folks in jails in the United States, and then they get deported to a country they often don't even speak the language, but it's on a bunch of different fronts. And I'd say two things. One is these people in the caravan are refugees from U.S. policy, and that this is not a natural disaster. So I'll just run through some of the pieces of this, what I would call the root causes. I mean, first of all, the repression, as you say, is tremendous. If you read the fine print, and I read the fine print of these stories, although it's very hard to keep, again, the heartbreak of caring about Hondurans, is if a lot of the fine print of the stories are about people leaving, it's the gangs and violence, and I'll talk about that, and poverty. But also, there are at least 3 former Congress members of the opposition that have been parts of caravans. Repeated stories of a woman that, the ACLU did this video with a bunch of movie stars reading someone's story, her testimony. Well, it turns out she had reported election fraud and been threatened with death for it and had to leave the country. There's a tremendous amount of repression that people are fleeing. And also, the fact of the years and years of repression is why you can't have alternative policies in Honduras, right? Because somebody like Berta Cáceres, the indigenous leader who was protesting a hydroelectric dam development that was destroying livelihoods, gets killed for that, right? And she was a vice presidential candidate in 2009. I mean, was a leader of the resistance as well. These people are being killed. So the people who are fighting for alternative policies are being driven out of the country or killed or in exile, like the folks in the room here. It's not an abstract thing, or it's right here in the room. And so I want to go through these factors one by one: the gangs and the violence, the gangs and the violence, and the poverty question, which is also important to unpack politically. First of all, the reporting is often that, and people indeed are fleeing gangs and violence and drug traffickers, as well as poverty. But they also are fleeing the corrupt police. And because the biggest thing that happened here is that the coup destroyed the rule of law. It was a massive criminal attack, but it also itself destroyed the judicial, anything that was there that, Honduras wasn't completely clean by any means before, but it destroyed almost any integrity in the judiciary. It made that anybody could do anything. You could kill anyone you wanted. You could steal anything you wanted, and that's still true, with about a 95% impunity rate. Okay, which means that the door was open for criminal activity of every kind. And that's when the gangs really take off. That's when the police really get spectacularly corrupt. That's when the narcos really start moving with the military. Okay, and so that means that the police are almost completely corrupt. They kill people all the time. They work with the gangs in the neighborhoods, and so it's not like it's over here is the government and over here is all the corruption. So the gangs proliferate, and the gangs are really, really dangerous. They kill people, they force women into various sexual relationships, they kill kids that aren't, everything you've all read is all true. And also the narcos kill people routinely who don't do what they want. But also they're also in cahoots with the police. Like I know small business people in San Pedro Sula that have been killed if they wouldn't pay their so-called extortion, and the extortion really starts taking off around 2013, 2014. It's not immediate, you know. And if I know somebody like in the town of La Lima, an old man that had a little music store, and the taxi people, the gangs come around once a week, and you have to pay $75 a month or they'll kill you. And he grumbled. He said, "I'm old man. I'm sick. I don't want to have to pay this." And the next 2 days later, all the police and military that have been patrolling the town disappeared for 2 days. Somebody comes and shoots them up. The police come back the next day, okay? And they don't come back for the killer. They come back to patrol the town. You can see this pure collusion with the police. So the gangs and the police the gang proliferation is part of state policy. It's not like it's over there. The drug traffickers are at the very top of the government. The Minister of Security and Defense, in charge of all the police and military, has been twice named in U.S. federal court for overseeing drug fights, Julian Pacheco Tinoco. So it's top to bottom. So it's not like they're just there's these racial stereotypes that somehow in Latin America the little brown people can't govern themselves. Okay, this is a government backed by the United States. These are security forces funded by the United States that are creating that violence and that are responsible for it in our tax dollars. The other piece of this is the poverty. Now, Honduras there's no golden age of Honduras, but there was a viable economy, a formal economy before the coup, much of which has been destroyed. But also, the sectors that keep being seen as the one of economic development and backed by the United States are in fact the sectors that are destroying livelihoods. One, for example, palm oil production, backed by the World Bank, the DNOT Corporation, and the folks, and then at least 150 campesinos in the Owan Valley have been assassinated as part of this struggle to impose palm oil production by the elites, particularly Miguel Facuse and the D9 Corporation, allegedly. I'm careful to say because he's threatened to sue me, although he's dead. There's still a corporation out there. And that's one model, and that destroys small farmer livelihoods. There's all this hydroelectric dam and mining development. The government, right after the coup, granted mining concessions under 30% of the country. All the land in the country, 30% of it has mining concessions. So you have these mines that just force indigenous people and small farmers off their lands. Hydroelectric dams are part of this energy corridor that's designed to send energy north to the United States in a very long-term plan. And the tourism on the Caribbean coast that's throwing the Afro-Indigenous Garifuna people off their traditional lands and fishing villages to have mega tourism projects. So the so-called economic development projects are actually destroying livelihoods. The two remaining sectors are agriculture, which is also extremely exploitative, and the maquiladoras, or apparel and auto parts export processing plants, in which people work 12 hours a day. It destroys their health. They're breathing cotton dust. Their eyesight goes bad. They only hire young people for a few years, and that's it. It's very destructive of people's health. So there's the Honduran economy. And then if you try to have, the small business sector has been obliterated by the extortions. And in fact, the chain stores are booming because the big transnational chains like Burger King and Kentucky Fried Chicken can afford to absorb the extortion, and other people can't. But also, cab drivers, bus drivers are routinely assassinated by the gangs if they don't pay their taxes, or even if they do sometimes. And so a lot of the killings you're seeing is part of this obliteration. So it's not like people have another model of what they can do to make a living. So what's left? Okay, the last piece of this is the state. So neoliberal policies imposed by the International Monetary Fund, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank, since the coup and before, have gutted the state. So the government has been borrowing money, and then it obliterates state services like the National Health Service, and they also rob state government, the government offices all the time. There's so much documentation of this incredible corruption. But also government jobs have been obliterated. Tens of thousands of good union government jobs have been obliterated. The teachers often don't get paid. The nurses and doctors in the public hospitals don't get paid. There's no dialysis machines in the public hospitals. And so basic state functions don't happen, and state services aren't there, and state workers have been fired or laid off. The IMF actually said a few years ago, we're helping the Honduran government lower their wage bill. Okay? That quote is in the book, I didn't make that up. It's in their executive committee minutes. And so that means that the functioning services of the state aren't there, as well as state jobs are obliterated. So then, what are your choices? Okay, you're a Honduran, you've got some level of education, and the education system is being obliterated. Your kids might get forced into gangs or raped on the way to school. What are you going to do? You know, what do you do? There's this whole discourse about Honduras, and I'm getting to rant here, which is about bad parenting. So here's a rant I don't usually get to say. It's always like those bad parents. If they would just not take their children on the road, if they would not just protest with their children. People take their children to demonstrations all the time because they're teaching them to struggle because they have no other choice, right? And the old people go to the demonstrations, very old people. And it's always this discourse that if Honduran parents, especially Honduran women, are somehow bad parents for taking their kids to the United States or sending their kids through with someone else to the United States, like, well, you tell me, what are those people supposed to be doing? And so it's not like, so if you're looking at root causes, okay, then the last thing is that the United States is backing this all away, okay? You know, tens of millions and millions of dollars to support the Honduran security forces. All this legitimation of the Honduran government as a legitimate, and in fact, it got much worse after 2014, that because of the work we've been doing in Congress, there was actually a lot of challenging going on of the US support for the post-coup regime. And when the first so-called crisis of the unaccompanied minors at the border in 2014, when 57,000 children were perceived to be a threat to the United States, that's when Biden steps in, Joe Biden and Obama, and they say, let's have $1 billion to support the three countries of Nicaragua, El Salvador, and, excuse me, not Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala with $1 billion, and the Congress gave them $750 million. And suddenly Juan Orlando was a hero supporting the little children of Honduras with nationalist love, when he was, in fact, a leader of this government that is viciously killing people. There's my rant.
Well, through it all in your book, one of the things that stands out is this vibrant civil society movement, independent of the old ossified political parties that have existed in Honduras and in many of these countries, the liberal, conservative, historical parties of the region. And you talk about this and you go into detail on the different social movements that have developed and have continued to persevere. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I actually talk, I guess, 3 or 4 many different kinds of social movements, and it's definitely 100 flowers blooming. And the most important one is the National Front of Popular Resistance, known as the Frente, which came together right the day of the coup. And some of those building blocks had been in place, and I actually talk about that in that NACLA article I wrote at the time. But it was this amazing coalition that we fantasize in the United States of the labor movement, the women's movement, the human rights community, the Afro-Indigenous movement, the Campesino movement, the Indigenous movement, and the LGBT movement, and the traditional left, and and people from the Liberal Party committed, and middle-class people committed to the rule of law. And the U.S. media always talked about it as Zelaya supporters, when actually it's not that simple. Most of those folks, including myself, we oh my God, we used to laugh about Zelaya and before the coup. He was not our hero, but he was a symbol of constitutional order. And that's what brought us, but the Frente was this huge, amazing coalition that would have hundreds of, thousands of people in the streets. When Zelaya finally came back in 2011, the mainstream papers said there were between 900,000 and 1.2 million people that poured into the streets just in the capital that day, and there's only 8 million people in the country at that time. Okay, so we're talking about a mass movement, and it really blew everybody away because I talk about this in the book because Hondurans didn't have that kind of pride. They knew about 1954 and the general strike, but that was not the cool place. And suddenly it was like, whoa! And kids are sitting up straight at the dinner table, and people are singing these songs, and the graffiti is like incredible, and the songs are great, and there's this amazing popular culture and music and cultural flowering that had never quite been there before in Honduras. And politicized a whole generation of young people too, and cut across, and you get these like the old Marxist-Leninist left of the labor movement referring to El Movimiento Gay. I mean, these like just beautiful cross alliances, and that movement really was thriving for about 2 years, and was repressed and tremendously. A second movement that is very different one that I talk about in the book is the so-called indignados, and these are middle-class people, many of whom supported the coup, that rose up when it was revealed that Juan Orlando Hernandez and the National Party had stolen the money from the National Health Service. And these people had had enough with the corruption since the coup. Their lives were being crumbling too. They had used the National Health Service or paid taxes for their employees into it, and they poured into the streets in 2015 in these beautiful torch marches in the dark, a very beautiful movement, and that included some former coup supporters, but was very powerful in calling for the resignation of Juan Orlando and of the Attorney General, who's still the Attorney General, Oscar Chinchilla. And that led to, people called for a commission on impunity and corruption like the one in Guatemala. If you've heard of CICIG in Guatemala, they wanted one for Honduras, organized by and overseen by the United Nations. The United States stepped in and instead imposed something called the MACHI, which is the MACCIH, is the acronym controlled by the Organization of the United States, of American States, that was a good one, which by this point was under U.S. control, that was designed for there to be an anti-corruption body that was under U.S. control, that would pick away at the edges of corruption, but not challenge Juan Orlando's power, which doesn't mean that the MACHI deal still doesn't try to do good things, and it's still important, but was designed to undercut this deeper demand for a UN commission, like the very important one in Guatemala, which itself is under assault as we speak. So that's the second movement. But also, there's also this amazing movements of campesinos to reoccupy their lands in the Awan Valley, and that is where you get the slow-moving massacre of campesinos ever since, coming on to this day. And also just a lot of struggles that are going on now in indigenous communities, Copin and in the La Esperanza area, and all over, there's actually a lot of very important anti-mining struggles going on all over Honduras right now, in which people are being killed or repressed, and also a journalist trying to kill them are being repressed, and that's not getting a lot of publicity, but that's still going on, and also flourishing of the women's movement and of the LGBT movement, while LGBTI activists and women are being assassinated routinely all over the country, and there people talk about femicides because the killings of women are so high, and LGBT activists are found, dead down alleyways, and so it's a story of tremendous, beautiful activism. It's not just a victim story, and there are these amazing leaders, especially these like goddess women. Lucy's one of them in the room here, but not just Bersa Cáceres, because he was assassinated, but Miriam Miranda of Ofrene, of the Verifina people. People like Berta Oliva, head of the human rights group COFAVE. There's Tirsa Flores Lanza, the Judges for Democracy. These people are amazing. It's been such a gift to work with these people, and that disappears from the powerless victims narrative about Honduras.
So where do we go from here now that there's supposedly going to be a Democratic House of Representatives that might be more sympathetic to at least holding hearings or doing some oversight? What is your expectation now, and what could possibly be done in Washington? 'Cause, there's nothing to expect, obviously, from the Trump administration, but do you have any hope that there might be a different perspective in Washington come January than what you've experienced over the past few years?
Here's the part where I sob. First of all, watch out for Marco Rubio, who's calling the shots at the State Department. Senator Marco Rubio, Republican, is very powerful on Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere Affairs. So he's a figure to watch. He's evidently the man behind what Pompeo and Bolton are doing, state and in the White House. So, I think I had some hopes of some particular members that that didn't get elected that would have been leaders on this. I think that there certainly is going to be some new people that are going to be really great, like Osorio Cortez, but also Ilhan Omar, who first one of the two first Muslim American members of Congress who replaced Keith Ellison, had went down to Honduras a year ago. I know she's going to care. One of her staff members was at my event last night. And we have hopes for a lot of these new progressive people. Also, the Progressive Caucus has, I think, 96 members now, and the Progressive Caucus has been really great on Honduras. And Jan Schakowsky, who has always been the amazing leader, is going to be there. Unfortunately, Elliot Engel, who you probably know more about than I do, from New York, who is going to be the new chair of Foreign Affairs, has been quite centrist on Honduras, often allied with the State Department. I don't think we're going to get great, although there's a lot of really great leaders of some of the committees. Foreign Affairs is unfortunately not where we're going to get the leadership. And so it's going to depend on the Progressive Caucus.
But that might mean that Engel could become a good a target of the solidarity movement, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, believe me, we try. I mean, and there's a complicated character named Norma Torres, who is first Central American member of Congress. I'm going to say this out loud because it's in the book. And she created a Central America caucus, and she has, again, been allied with the State Department more or less, and will posture about anti-corruption, but has worked to block every initiative that many of us in the solidarity movement have fought for in the last several years, including the Berta Cáceres Human Rights in Honduras Act, which will be reintroduced again in January by Hank Johnson. It has 71 members currently on it. So the first thing we're going to do, if you want to do something, we have to get everybody that was on it before. They have to re-up. We have to get all the new people up. And Norma Torres has not signed on to it and worked actively against it. So she's moving up, and she's on the Foreign Affairs Committee and herds a lot of people on foreign affairs that were progressive on Honduras. So the other thing is there's some new people in the Congress. We've been paying attention to the progressive people, but if you saw the New York Times article about how complicated it is in the House, there's also all these ex-military people, all the people that ran to the right of Pelosi. There's Donna Shalala, who is closely allied with the Clintons. There's Tom Malinowski, who comes from the State Department, Department of Human Rights. And so, there's a lot of people we don't know how they're going to come down. And so it's not just a question of the new progressives. The Senate, the Senate is Leahy, and Leahy is amazing. Jeff Merkley is really good. Cardin is good. There's a lot. Jack Reed is paying attention. There was just a letter that came out in October about threats to human rights defenders and foreign observers in Honduras, threats by the government and by private actors. And there were 13 senators on that, which is a really big deal, including Durbin and Jack Reed, and it was very high-ranking people as well as, and it was led by Markey, and we had 38 members, I think 39 in the House. So that's a sign that Senate is paying attention, but again, we don't have majority, and also Menendez is bad. He'll make some, you know more about Menendez than I do, but if Menendez had lost, then Cardin would be the ranking Democrat, and we'd be cooking with gas. And he has really great staff, and he really pays attention to Honduras, and that didn't happen. Right, so Menendez is close to Rubio, and so look, I wish I could say there's a happy ending here, except that we put a lot of hope in these new progressives, and that really opens things up. And also, whether Pelosi is farther away from the Obama years, will Pelosi be more liberated? And it's going to depend on the pressure on Pelosi from the Progressive Caucus, and that's where all of us come in here, and they respond to constituents. I can tell you, this isn't part of my learning curve. I always thought, oh, Congress is a waste of time. And the last, I'm not going to be one of those old ladies that says, call your congressperson. And I get aides all the time that tell me, if we just had 3 phone calls, then I can tell my boss, meaning the Congress member, that the constituents support this, right? Because the aides often want to do the right thing, and they have to have constituents, right? So those phone calls actually matter, right? So, and much to my surprise, and I actually, just mostly me and a couple other people got my Congress member Sam Farr to do a lot for years and years, partly just because of my pressure. And, I played various things within the district, but you can do that too, always look bigger than you are. Hi, I represent 60,000 Presbyterians, or I represent all the teachers of the state of New York. It's very easy to figure out something that's larger than yourself that you just happen to be connected to, but it's going to take pressure. I don't think we're going to have some new golden age because of this new house. I wish we had a different chair of foreign affairs, right? That's the problem. And Norma Torres is on Foreign Affairs, Western Hemisphere, and Albio Series, is in there. We don't have a really great lineup on the Latin America side of things, unfortunately. It's I'm sorry I don't have happy news there.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up to maybe for a few questions, and either about the book or about any of the discussion we've had so far. And if you can keep it to a question.